Hello and welcome to this week's 2 by Tuesday. This week I'm exploring a question that I get asked quite a bit actually about how do you recall information, quotes, facts in the moment when you're having a conversation or leading a group discussion. And it's something I've really purposely tried to get better at. And it happened almost organically as a result of doing my first time facilitator podcast. If you listen to the early interviews, I really wasn't connecting what I was hearing back from guests with other things. But as it progressed, I got more confidence in it. So the good thing is, I think this is a skill. It's like a muscle. And the more you start thinking about doing it and trying it, you'll get better at it. I want to share 4 different approaches to thinking about this. This 2 by 2 is really forming around how you can record the ideas and the concepts and the quotes that you hear so that in the moment you can replay it back. There's something I want to share though before even jumping into the 2 by 2, and that is the concept of a trigger or something called a listen for. The skill is to have a word that you're listening for. So for example, if you hear the word innovation, that might remind you of a quote about innovation. It's a listen for word. It's a trigger word that can then spiral and let you replay something that you've thought about in the past. So for all these concepts, what we want to think about is, what is this story, this fact, this quote actually about? What's the trigger word? And then when I hear that trigger word in conversation, either later today or later in the year, I can recall this fact. So you kind of want to categorize it in your mind when you hear it so that you can recall it back. Let's kick it off by exploring what the 2 axes are. I'll start with the y-axis. I've got 2 categories. So the first one is you're going to use it. So the second that you hear the quote or phrase or fact, you're going to use it. And it's more like sort of short term and not short-term memory, but you want to actually, give yourself like 1 or 2 days, then practically use it in some type of context. And there's the bottom of that, of the y-axis, is you're just going to consume it. So you'll hear the fact or the concept and you're just listening for it. So you're like, oh, that's interesting. And on the x-axis, on the right here, we've got public. You're going to use this concept and actually use it in a public forum with someone else, not just yourself, which means on the right here, we've got private. So this is your own way of recording what you've heard, what you've listened to, what you found really interesting, things that you've read, etc. Top right, we've got, you're going to use it in the moment and you're going to do this in a public way. This is probably the one that I rely on the most, is I guess for forced accountability. I actually think it's great fun. So more recently on this podcast, you would have heard me talk about my trip to Hawaii. And I said on that show, the reason I did that is because I wanted to really cement some of the things that I've learnt from that trip. And a way for me to do that was to share it on a public forum. Any type of like content creation where you're actually hitting publish. So it could be a LinkedIn post, it's going out public. You've heard a really cool fact or figure, you're going to throw it onto a social platform or something just to reinforce it. And so it works really well because you're sharing it with other people to boost their capability, but also for yourself because as you share it, you're getting better at retaining the information. I've got something called a timestamp as well. This is how I use it in the context of workshops or a group conversation. Is I'll hear someone say something, and because I know what, say, the workshop is about, I think that's going to relate nicely to when I talk about this model in future. Something I'll actually say to myself is like, I'm going to timestamp that. Tim Ferriss talks about it on his podcast when he interviews a guest. He says, oh, I'll double click that. In your own mind, you're just taking a pause, a fraction of a second. You're saying, I'm going to timestamp that. Julie said this. That's going to come in really handy when this comes later on. So you're just doing that in your own memory. Let's go to the bottom right. And this is where you're going to consume it, but in public. So I actually think it's still a public thing. The public, though, is more of a one-to-one conversation. I do this very often. I'll be driving to have a coffee with someone. I'm listening to a podcast and something really hits me. And in the conversation over a coffee, I'll share it with a friend. So again, it's just cementing that. It's public, but it's more about sharing that consumption at a smaller level through a one-to-one conversation. On the top left here, we have, you're going to use it, but you're going to use it in a private way. Something I'm going to talk about here, I've got H4L, Homework for Life. This is a concept by Matthew Dicks. I've talked about it often on his book called Storyworthy. So what Matthew Dicks suggests is that every day, at the end of the day, just reflect and think about one story or thing that happened to you and put it into an Excel spreadsheet or whatever way you want to store it. Jenny Blake, who I mention often on the show, uses a tool called Notion to share her homework for life. I've got a story I share about chickens. I've used it in many different contexts, but in the second column of that, I'll have the story. So basically 1 or 2 sentences of what happened. And then I think, well, what are one or two ways this story could be used? And you find that stories have multiple ways that you can like have that listen for or trigger word. But I think for the chicken story, I've used things like autonomy, micromanagement has been part of that. So these are like trigger words. So if I was to have a conversation with someone, I could then think about the chicken story and draw it out. I've assigned the story with a trigger word, with a listen for word, so that when I hear it, I can share it. But it starts with documenting it every day. So a good format for that, I've put in, so Notion is one, just storing it on Google Sheets. I mean, a really basic one that I use, I was out yesterday with some friends and they were telling me about all these cool things that I should read and look at. And I just use the notes on my iPhone, but I'll also tag it with like TV show or article or something to check out. So add your own tags for that. They could be your listen for words as well. And the bottom left here, you're going to consume it, but in a private way. And something I used to do that, and not many people are using it. I love it. I have my own private podcast set up. So the podcast is called Things Leanne Needs to Listen Back To. And any important Zoom conversation, I mean, I'm part of a mastermind, so we've got a private podcast as well, but I signed up for a course on article writing. And it was delivered through video. So I thought, I'm just going to put this onto MP3 format. And in the car, I'm just going to start listening to it. And for me, when I hear something, I can recall it very quickly, as opposed to when I read it, I find it more difficult to recall. Therefore, anything that's important, that's worth listening back to, that's worth recording, I just take a private podcast. If I'm out on a run and I'm listening to something on a podcast or an Audible book, it really sings out to me, I will jog at a slower pace and I'll hit screen record on my iPhone and just record that. Then I save it to a folder on my phone. The other way, of course, you can journal and things like that. The only thing with journaling is that the categorization of information can be really difficult. However, writing is a good way to then just reinforce something that you're thinking about. So those are a few different ways that you can think about storing that information. And of course, back to what I said at the beginning of this episode, what you want to do, and things easier said than done, is about staying present. The hardest part about, well, initially being an interviewer, is that I'm constantly trying to think ahead. And you do this with facilitation as well. You want to drive the conversation in a certain direction. And if you can have a listen for and relate something and then use that to propel it forward, then that's the goal. That's where you want to go. So I think a combination of these things, find out which one works well for you. My personal preferences are probably the top right and the bottom left. I'd love to hear how you record any cool facts, information, and things like that. Of course, this isn't for studying, for assessments or anything like that. It's more about how do you recall something in the moment. And the key phrase, I think, for all of us is to search for what that listen for is and to categorize your information accordingly. I hope that helps. Have a good one.